Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at common law,
Okay.
specifically through this YouTube video called, the title's a bit of a mouthful, it's Common Law Handbook for Jurors, Sheriffs, Bailiffs, and Justices.
Wow, that is a mouthful.
It is. But, I think a lot of people hear common law and think, oh, isn't that like a thing of the past?
Yeah, definitely.
But this video kind of presents it as something that's still very much alive and well, and challenges a lot of conventional thinking about the legal system and individual rights and the role of citizens.
Right.
It's really interesting.
Yeah, I think one of the things that makes it so interesting is, like you said, it connects to this idea that, individuals can really be empowered in the legal system,
Right.
and especially through things like grand juries and, really leaning on the office of the sheriff and even just, the role of being a juror. It really emphasizes that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm definitely intrigued. But before we get too far into all that, I kind of want to take a step back,
Sure.
For those of us who maybe haven't been to law school, can you break down what common law actually is?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that the easiest way to understand common law is to think of it as a system that's based on precedent.
Okay.
So it really relies on past rulings that judges have made, and how those decisions have evolved over time.
Mhm.
So it's different from like statutory law, which is the laws that are written and passed by legislatures like Congress.
Okay. So it's less about like a fixed set of rules and more about how judges have interpreted the law in previous cases.
Exactly. Yeah. So common law builds on itself. It creates this like body of legal principles that are based on how similar cases were decided in the past.
I see. I see.
And it almost becomes like a roadmap based on real world situations.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Now, this video goes so far as to claim that common law is like the law,
Oh, wow.
like the real law or the supreme law of the land. And they even suggest that it can supersede statutes that contradict it.
Wait, hold on. So they're saying that like a law passed by Congress, for example,
Right.
could actually be invalid if it goes against common law.
Yep. That's the argument they're making.
How does that even work?
Well, I think it gets to how they view the relationship between the people and the government.
Sure.
They see common law as this thing that that springs from like the customs and traditions of the people,
Mm-hmm.
and that it represents a deeper sense of justice that should guide legal decisions, even over laws passed by legislature.
So to them, it's almost like common law reflects a more fundamental sense of right and wrong,
Right.
one that even the government can't just like override.
Exactly. Yeah. And they also have interesting take on things like codes, rules, regulations, all that kind of stuff. They argue that those things are meant to govern the actions of government authorities,
Oh,
not private individuals.
interesting.
So they see a distinction between the laws that apply to the government and the laws that apply to individuals.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this video kind of frames the whole legal system in a different light,
Yeah.
It seems like they're really emphasizing individual liberty and limiting the power of the state, which is interesting. And speaking of individual empowerment, they talk a lot about the grand jury system. What's their take on that?
They present a really unique perspective on the grand jury.
Okay,
They call it like a fourth branch of government.
a fourth branch of government.
Yeah, a body that directly represents the people and acts as a check on government power.
I've never heard it described that way. That's not how I learned it in school.
Right.
What makes them view it that way?
Well, they claim that that the grand jury's authority comes straight from the Bill of Rights,
Yeah.
not from the government itself.
Interesting.
So specifically, they point to the Fifth Amendment,
Right.
which guarantees the right to a grand jury indictment for, serious federal crimes.
So they're saying that the grand jury's power comes from like a higher source,
Right.
not from the government that it's supposed to be overseeing.
Exactly. Yeah. And they introduce this concept of consent to indict,
Consent to indict. Okay.
which means that the government can't just bring criminal charges against someone without first getting permission from the people.
Mm.
And that permission is given through the grand jury's decision to indict.
Okay.
So essentially, the grand jury acts as a safeguard,
Right.
protecting individuals from being unjustly accused by the state.
That's a That's a pretty big responsibility.
It is.
So the grand jury gets to decide whether there's even enough evidence to go to trial.
Yeah. Yeah. And the video emphasizes that the government needs that approval, that consent from the grand jury
Right.
before they can move forward with a case. And
Mm-hmm.
to them, that's a crucial element of individual liberty and a key difference between common law systems and systems that are based solely on statutory law.
It definitely makes you think about how much power the grand jury really has. Do they often refuse to indict? And what happens when they do?
That's a good question. It certainly raises some interesting um, questions about how that dynamic between the government and the people actually plays out in the legal system.
Right.
And there are definitely cases where grand juries have refused to indict,
Right.
sometimes in really high-profile cases, and those decisions can have a significant impact on how justice is carried out.
Yeah, it sounds like that this idea of consent to indict could really, really shift the balance of power in a lot of ways. This deep dive is already making me rethink some pretty basic assumptions about the legal system.
I think that's one of the things that's so interesting about this video,
Yeah.
is that it really challenges you to think about things from a different perspective.
Hmm. Speaking of power dynamics, the video got pretty intense when it started talking about jurisdiction and consent in the courtroom.
Oh, yeah.
And I gotta admit, that part left me a little confused.
That's understandable. I mean, it is a complex issue, and the video presents a rather unconventional take on it.
Okay.
But I think the core idea is that courts only have jurisdiction over you, meaning the authority to make legal decisions that affect you if you consent to their jurisdiction.
Wait, so they're saying that judges and courts don't just automatically have power over people? How can that be?
Well, that's what the video argues,
Hmm.
and they really focus on a specific moment in the courtroom to illustrate their point.
Okay.
Think about that moment when a judge asks you, "Do you understand?" Maybe they're explaining your rights or the charges against you.
Oh yeah, I've seen that on TV a million times. It seems pretty standard.
Right, exactly. It seems very routine, but the video claims that when you answer yes to that question,
Right.
you're actually consenting to the court's authority over you.
Whoa. So just saying yes to "Do you understand" carries like a lot more weight than I realized.
According to this video, it's incredibly significant. It basically determines whether you're willingly participating in the legal process or being subjected to it against your will.
Right.
And they go on to argue that if you haven't consented but you're still detained for violating a statute or something,
Right.
that detention is essentially kidnapping.
Okay. Now that's a pretty radical interpretation.
It is.
So in their view, just saying yes to that seemingly innocent question could be the difference between like a legitimate legal process and something that's basically kidnapping.
That's their argument, and it really it challenges us to think about what consent means in a legal context,
Right.
and where that line between legitimate authority and overreach really lies.
Yeah, I'm starting to see why this video is considered controversial.
Yeah.
It definitely pushes the boundaries of how we usually think about the legal system. And speaking of pushing boundaries, the video painted a really interesting picture of the sheriff.
Mm-hmm.
I always thought that sheriffs were mainly about, catching criminals and keeping the peace, but they presented the sheriff as a pretty important figure in all of this.
Yeah, they dig a lot deeper, I think, than that traditional view of the sheriff, and they trace this historical evolution of the sheriff's role.
Okay.
All the way back to medieval England through the American frontier and into modern times. And they paint this picture of the sheriff as like the last line of defense
Wow.
when it comes to upholding the Constitution and protecting citizens' rights.
So there's a much bigger like constitutional dimension to their role than I think most people realize.
Exactly, yeah. They present the sheriff as a almost like a guardian against government overreach.
Mm-hmm.
Someone who's supposed to ensure that the law is applied fairly and that individual liberties are protected.
Okay, so if the sheriff is like this constitutional watchdog, what specific powers or responsibilities do they have that relate to all that? I mean, how does that actually work in practice?
Well, they argue that the sheriff's role goes beyond just traditional law enforcement.
Okay.
They say that the sheriff is responsible for making sure that courts operate within constitutional limits, that jails are run constitutionally, and even that community corrections programs are, aligned with the Constitution.
That's a huge range of responsibilities.
Yeah.
It seems like they're putting a lot of faith in the sheriff's understanding of the Constitution.
All right.
What if their interpretation differs from that of other officials or even the courts? I mean, who gets to decide who's right in that situation?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it highlights, I think, some of the complexities and potential tensions that are inherent in this view of the sheriff's role.
Right.
It raises some fundamental questions about, how power is balanced and exercised in a society that values both individual liberty and the rule of law.
Yeah, it definitely adds another layer to this whole idea of citizen empowerment.
Right.
It's like they're suggesting that we have a responsibility not only to understand our own rights, but also to hold those in power accountable, including the sheriff, to make sure that those rights are protected.
Exactly, and that brings us to another provocative argument that the video makes, which is their stance on who has the right to practice law.
Okay.
And this one really challenges some very fundamental assumptions about the legal profession.
All right. Well, I'm definitely curious to hear more about that, but I think I need a minute to process all this first. This is a lot of information. It's already given me a lot to think about.
It's definitely a lot to unpack.
It is.
But I think it's worth it because it really makes you question a lot of the things that we take for granted about, how the legal system works and the role we play in it.
All right. Well, I'm ready to dive back in when you are.
Okay, great.
Okay. So you were telling me about the video's take on who can practice law.
Right. Yeah. So this is where they really lean into this idea of individual empowerment. They basically argue that practicing law, it's a fundamental right,
Okay.
and that it can't be licensed or controlled by the state.
Wait, so are they saying that anyone can just practice law?
Yeah.
Like, regardless of whether they have a law degree or pass the bar exam?
Yeah, that's what they're saying.
Yeah.
They even say that individuals can ignore, like, the licenses and fees that are, typically associated with being a lawyer.
I mean, that seems incredibly controversial, to say the least. I mean, the entire legal profession is built on the idea that you need specific qualifications and training to practice law. There are reasons why those rules exist, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And the video doesn't necessarily dispute, the value of legal expertise or anything like that.
Okay.
Their argument is more about who gets to decide who can practice law.
Okay.
They believe it's an inherent right,
Right.
not something that the state should be able to grant or deny.
So in their view, the state licensing of lawyers is actually like an infringement on individual rights.
Exactly, yeah. They see it as the state overstepping its bounds,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
interfering with a fundamental freedom that every individual should have.
Okay, I'm noticing a pattern here.
Yeah.
This video seems to really consistently advocate for limiting the state's power while expanding the power of the individual.
Right.
It's a very different way of looking at the relationship between citizens and the government.
It is, and it's one that's as we've seen, kind of sparked a lot of controversy and debate.
Right, for sure.
But it's certainly an interesting perspective to consider.
It is. It is. The video also, they talked about remedies for injuries. If someone's rights are violated, what can they do about it? What was their main takeaway on that?
Yeah, so this is where the video gets pretty practical.
Okay.
And they focus on this legal maxim. It goes, every right, when withheld, must have a remedy, and every injury its proper redress.
Okay.
And they attribute that to William Blackstone,
Okay.
who was this very famous 18th century English jurist, had a huge influence on legal thinking. And essentially what that maxim means is that, if your rights are violated, there has to be a legal way to seek, compensation or justice.
Right. So it's not just about having rights in theory.
Right.
It's about having like a real way to enforce those rights if they're violated.
Exactly. Yeah. And they then take this principle and apply it specifically to situations where individuals are interacting with government officials.
Okay.
So they argue that citizens have the right to sue government officials who violate their constitutional rights.
So they're saying that like if the government oversteps its bounds, citizens actually have legal recourse. Do they give any specific examples of how that might work?
They do. Yeah, they cite specific U.S. codes
Okay.
that they believe provide a legal avenue for citizens to, challenge unlawful government actions.
Okay.
For example, they mention 18 U.S. Code, Section 242,
Right.
which deals with the deprivation of rights under color of law.
So they're basically giving people like legal tools to hold government officials accountable.
Yeah, and they really stress the importance of citizens,
Mm-hmm.
knowing their rights and being willing to, to stand up for those rights.
It's a very empowering message. It makes me think about, my own rights and how I might exercise them more actively.
Right. Yeah, I think that's one of the goals of the video,
Yeah.
is to really encourage people to think about these things and to take ownership of their rights.
Mm-hmm. All this talk about individual rights and liberties, though, it makes you wonder, like, where does the government's authority come from?
Right.
And what are its limits? How does the video address that?
That's an excellent question.
Yeah.
And it leads us right into the next section of the video, where they delve into the topics of sovereignty
Okay.
and the 14th Amendment. And this is where it gets really interesting and potentially even more controversial.
Okay, I'm ready for it.
All right, let's dive in.
All right, sovereignty and the 14th Amendment. This is where things get really complex, right?
Yeah, it can be a bit tricky to wrap your head around.
Yeah.
But the video offers a very specific interpretation of the 14th Amendment
Okay.
that I think is really central to their whole argument.
Mm-hmm.
The 14th Amendment, it was passed after the Civil War,
Right.
and it deals with, citizenship rights and equal protection under the law.
Right. Right. So how does this video interpret the 14th Amendment? What's their unique take on it?
Well, the key distinction they make is between the terms people and citizens.
Okay.
They argue that only people are truly sovereign. Like they possess these inherent natural rights that exist independently of any government.
Right.
Whereas citizens, they view them as having a slightly different status.
So they're suggesting that citizens have like fewer rights than people?
Yeah, I think that's kind of the implication.
I'm not sure I follow the distinction.
It's subtle, but it's important to their argument.
Okay.
They believe that that by claiming the status of citizen, an individual is, in a way, choosing to submit to the authority of the state.
Mm-hmm.
They become subject to the rules and regulations that the government creates in exchange for, the benefits and protections that citizenship provides.
So they're saying that by accepting citizenship, you're kind of giving up some of your inherent sovereignty.
That's the gist of their argument. Yeah.
Okay.
They believe that government officials, bureaucrats, all those folks, they derive their authority from the consent of the people.
Mm-hmm.
But they're still subject to the laws and regulations that they create.
Oh,
They don't possess that same inherent sovereignty as the people.
It's almost like they envision a hierarchy, with the people at the top.
Right.
Then government officials and then citizens.
Yeah, it's a very different way of looking at the power structure of society.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. And it leads into, I guess, the video's final point.
Right.
Which focuses on the importance of virtue as a foundation for justice and liberty.
Yeah, it's an interesting transition, isn't it? We go from legal theory to morality.
Right. Yeah. How do they connect those ideas?
Well, they draw a direct link between biblical teachings about, love, honesty, good conduct,
Right.
all that kind of stuff, and the concept of a just society. They argue that a society that's rooted in virtue is more likely to uphold individual rights and to limit government overreach.
So they're saying that individual morality is essential for a free and just society.
Yes, and they back this up by quoting founding fathers like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington,
Okay.
who often spoke about the importance of morality and religion for a free society.
That's fascinating because there's always this debate, about the separation of church and state,
Right.
and whether, religious beliefs should influence law and government. And this video seems to be kind of pushing back against that, against a strict separation.
I think so.
They're arguing that virtue and morality, even if they are rooted in religious principles, are essential for a society that values individual liberty and limited government.
Yeah, it's a perspective that definitely sparks debate.
It does. It does. But even if you don't agree with their interpretation of the Bible or the founding fathers or anything like that, it does raise an interesting point, you know?
Hmm.
Can a society that disregards virtue and morality truly uphold justice and individual rights?
That's the question.
That's a question worth pondering, I think, regardless of your personal beliefs.
I agree. I think by bringing in those broader philosophical and even spiritual dimensions, the video, it encourages us to think about the legal system in a more holistic way. It's not just about laws and procedures. It's about the values and principles that underpin a just and free society.
This whole deep dive has been like a whirlwind of information and challenging ideas. I feel like I've learned a lot, but I also have more questions than when we started.
That's often the case, I think, when you start to really delve into a topic like this.
Yeah.
It's not about necessarily finding all the answers,
Right.
but about sparking that curiosity, and encouraging critical thinking.
Well said. But before we wrap up, I want to go back to that initial question I asked,
Mm.
is common law just a relic of the past, or does it still have relevance in our modern world?
I think the perspective that's presented in this video suggests that it's anything but ancient history.
Maybe.
They see it as this living, breathing system of principles that can be applied to contemporary legal issues, particularly when it comes to safeguarding individual liberty and limiting government power.
It's a perspective that definitely challenges conventional legal thinking. It invites us to rethink our role as citizens in a society that's governed by law.
Yeah.
But let's be real, some of the claims that they're making in this video are pretty unconventional, even radical, I'd say.
Yeah.
How does this interpretation of common law hold up against, kind of like mainstream legal thinking?
That's a great point. I think it's important to acknowledge that this video is presenting a very particular interpretation of common law,
Right.
one that really emphasizes, individual liberties and limits on state power.
Mm-hmm.
There are definitely other legal scholars who would challenge some of the claims that they're making,
Right.
particularly those related to jurisdiction, consent, and this idea of practicing law without a license.
So maybe I shouldn't try to argue my way out of a speeding ticket based on what I learned here.
Probably not, no. This is more about sparking your curiosity, and
Yeah.
encouraging you to think critically about the legal system.
Nice.
It's not about giving you, ready-made legal arguments to use in court.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
But-
But even if some of the specific claims are up for debate, I still think there's a lot of value in that core message about understanding our rights and being active citizens.
Absolutely. I completely agree. Regardless of where you stand on, the finer points of legal theory, I think the video's emphasis on participating in the legal process and holding those in power accountable, that's something we can all learn from.
Yeah, it's a message that feels especially timely today.
Right.
With
right.
all the debates about the role of government and individual freedoms.
Mhm.
It really makes you think about what it means to be a citizen in a democratic society.
And that brings up another thought-provoking question, I think, that wasn't directly addressed in the video, but one that I think is crucial to consider. If this view of common law as this system built on consent and individual responsibility, if that's accurate, what does that say about our collective duty to make sure it works fairly and justly for everyone?
That's a great question. It suggests that we can't just, sit back and assume that the legal system will take care of itself.
Right.
We need to be engaged, participate actively, and hold each other accountable to those principles of fairness and justice.
Exactly. It's about realizing that the legal system isn't some distant, entity.
Mm-hmm.
It's a reflection of our values,
Right.
our choices, and our willingness to work together to create a more just and equitable society.
That's a powerful thought to end on. It reminds us that we all have a part to play in safeguarding those ideals of justice and liberty for ourselves and for the generations to come. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
I hope it's inspired you to think more deeply about common law and its ongoing impact on our lives.